The rain kept falling that Friday evening, turning the city streets into rivers of reflected neon lights. It was just past 8 p.m. when Officer Robert Chen sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. He wasn't having a good day. His supervisor had questioned his arrest record again, pointing out some uncomfortable patterns that he didn't want to think about. That's when he spotted the black Tesla Model 3 cruising down Madison Avenue. The car was well within the speed limit, but something about it made Chen's jaw tighten. Maybe it was the tinted windows, or maybe it was something else he didn't want to admit to himself. Without giving it much thought, he flipped on his lights. The Tesla pulled over smoothly, following every protocol perfectly. Chen noticed how the driver immediately turned on the interior lights and placed both hands on the steering wheel. Clearly someone who knew the drill. Through the rain-streaked window, he could make out a man in his mid-50s wearing a charcoal gray sweater that looked like it cost more than Chen's entire uniform. "License and registration," Chen barked, shining his flashlight directly into the car. The beam revealed a face that remained remarkably calm, despite the harsh light. The driver moved slowly, deliberately, reaching for his wallet with the kind of patience that came from years of dealing with similar situations. "Good evening, officer," the driver said quietly, handing over his documents. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" Chen barely glanced at the license. "You were swerving back there." It wasn't true, and they both knew it. "Had anything to drink tonight?" "No, sir. I don't drink." The driver's voice remained steady, professional. "I'm actually heading home from work." Chen's flashlight beam swept across the car's interior, looking for anything he could use. The car was immaculate, not even a coffee cup in the holder. But something about the driver's composure made Chen even more determined to find a problem. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Chen's hand rested on his holster, a habit he'd developed over years that he didn't even notice anymore. The driver took a deep breath, then pressed a small button on his dashboard. Chen didn't realize it, but the car's built-in cameras were now recording everything from multiple angles. The driver unfastened his seatbelt with deliberate movements. As he opened the door, the interior light revealed more details. The driver wore a gold wedding ring and had a small pin on his sweater label that Chen didn't recognize. If he had looked closer, he would have seen it was the Federal Judges Association pin. Two more patrol cars pulled up, their lights painting the wet street in rotating reds and blues. Officer Walker stepped out of one car, immediately recognizing the driver. The color drained from his face. "Chen," Walker called out, his voice carrying an urgent warning. But Chen was too focused on proving his suspicions right to notice the shift in his colleague's tone. The rain continued to fall, washing away everything except the tension that hung in the air. In that moment, none of them knew this traffic stop would soon spark a chain of events that would change their department, their city, and their own lives in ways they never could have imagined. What happened in the next few minutes would make headlines, but the real story, the one about justice, prejudice, and unexpected redemption, was just beginning. Officer Chen's flashlight beam cut through the rain as the driver stepped out of his Tesla, water droplets rolling off his expensive sweater. The tension in the air was thick enough to touch. Behind them, red and blue lights continued to paint the wet streets in alternating colors. "Spread your legs and put your hands on the car," Chen ordered, his voice carrying that edge of authority he perfected over years. But something felt different this time. The driver's calm demeanor wasn't the usual nervous politeness he encountered. It was something else entirely. "Officer," the driver said quietly, following the instructions with practiced ease, "I want to be clear that I'm complying fully, but I'm also noting that there's no probable cause for this search." Chen felt his face grow hot. "Sir, I detect the smell of marijuana coming from your vehicle." It was another lie, and somehow the driver's slight head shake made Chen even angrier. Officer Walker, who had rushed over from his patrol car, tried to intervene. "Chen, hold up a second." But Chen was already patting down the driver's legs, his movements aggressive and purposeful. "What's this?" he demanded, feeling something in the driver's pocket. "That's my phone," the driver replied evenly. "And my court ID is in my back pocket. I suggest you look at it." Walker's face went pale. "Chen, that's Judge. I don't care who he is." Chen snapped, but his hand was already pulling out the ID wallet. In the gleam of the streetlight, the gold judicial badge caught the light, and Chen felt his stomach drop. The driver, now clearly identified as one of the state's most respected federal judges, turned around slowly. "Officer Chen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades in courtrooms, "I believe we're done here. But this situation isn't over." Other officers who had arrived at the scene stood frozen, watching the scenario unfold. A small crowd had gathered under the shelter of a nearby bus stop, cell phones recording everything. The rain seemed to fall harder, as if nature itself was trying to wash away the moment. "Sir, Chen's voice trailed off as reality crashed in. His hands, usually steady, began to shake slightly. The judge straightened his sweater, somehow managing to maintain his dignity despite being soaked by the rain. "I want every officer's badge number who's present," he said, looking at each cop in turn. "And I want the footage from all your body cameras secured." A passing city bus slowed down, its passengers pressing against the windows to watch. Someone from the crowd called out, "We got it all on video, Judge." The judge simply nodded, acknowledging without encouraging. Chen stood rooted to the spot, his flashlight now pointed at the ground, creating a pool of light that seemed to shrink away from the scene. Officer Walker had already pulled out his notebook, writing down his own information without being asked. "Officer Chen," the judge said, his voice cutting through the sound of rain and distant traffic, "you should know that I've spent my career believing in second chances and the possibility of change. Remember that in the coming weeks." With that, he turned back to his car, every movement measured and deliberate. The gathered crowd parted respectfully as another officer rushed to hold an umbrella over the judge, a gesture that seemed to emphasize just how badly Chen had misjudged the situation. As the Tesla's lights came to life, and it pulled smoothly away from the curb, Chen felt the weight of what he'd done settling onto his shoulders. The crowd began to disperse, but their phones were already uploading videos that would soon race across social media. The night's rain couldn't wash away what had just happened. Officer Walker stepped close to Chen, speaking low enough that only he could hear. "You have no idea what you've just started." Chen watched the Tesla's taillights disappear into the rainy night, knowing that his career, and perhaps his entire life, had just taken a turn he never saw coming. The blue and red lights continued to flash, but now they seemed to be counting down to something. The end of one chapter and the beginning of another, far more complicated one. The morning news hit like a thunderclap. By sunrise, every major network was running the cell phone footage of last night's traffic stop. The police department's phones wouldn't stop ringing, and Chief Richardson hadn't slept a wink since getting the midnight call about the incident. "What do you mean you didn't recognize him?" the chief bellowed, pacing his office while Officer Chen sat stiffly in the chair across from his desk. The morning sunlight streaming through the blinds seemed to highlight every bead of sweat on Chen's forehead. "Sir, I was just following protocol." Chen started, but the chief cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Protocol." The chief picked up his tablet, where a news website blazed with the headline, "Federal Judge Profiled in Late-Night Traffic Stop. Since when is harassing a respected federal judge protocol? The mayor's been calling every hour. The press is camped outside." Through the office's glass walls, Chen could see other officers avoiding eye contact as they hurried past. These same people who usually greeted him with friendly nods now treated him like he had some contagious disease. Meanwhile, across town in the federal courthouse, the judge was doing something unexpected. He was going about his day as usual. He walked into his courtroom precisely at 9 a.m., his robes perfectly pressed, showing no sign of last night's rain-soaked confrontation. "All rise," the bailiff called out, and as the courtroom stood, reporters in the back row craned their necks, hungry for any hint of drama. But they found none. The judge handled his cases with the same calm efficiency he was known for, though everyone noticed he'd scheduled an unexpected meeting with the police commissioner for later that afternoon. Back at the precinct, Officer Walker sat in internal affairs, describing what he'd witnessed. "Look," he said, leaning forward in his chair, "Chen's got a history. We all knew it, but nobody wanted to be the one to say something." The IA investigator's pen scratched across his notepad. A history of what, exactly? Walker took a deep breath, knowing he was crossing a line you don't cross in law enforcement, speaking against another officer. But the weight of years of witnessed incidents finally won out. Pull his traffic stop data. Look at who he pulls over, who he searches. The pattern's pretty clear. By lunchtime, social media was ablaze with different versions of the video. Some showed the full incident, others were edited to show just the most tense moments. Comment sections filled with heated debates about police reform, racial profiling, and justice. Local community leaders began organizing a protest for the weekend. But then something unexpected happened. The judge's office released a statement that surprised everyone. While last night's incident highlights ongoing concerns about law enforcement practices, I believe the focus should be on systemic change rather than individual punishment. I will continue to handle this matter through proper legal channels, and I encourage the community to remain peaceful as we work toward meaningful reform. The statement threw fuel on the fire of public discussion, but not in the way anyone expected. Here was a man who had every right to be angry, choosing instead to focus on solutions. In the police department's break room, Chen sat alone, staring at his untouched coffee. His phone kept buzzing with messages from fellow officers, family members, even old friends from the academy. Everyone wanted to know his side of the story. But how could he explain something he was only now beginning to understand about himself? Officer Walker passed by, hesitated, then sat down across from Chen. "The judge's law clerk just called the station," he said quietly. "You know what's weird? He's not filing any personal charges against you." Chen looked up, confused. "What?" "Yeah," Walker continued, stirring his own coffee. "Instead, he's pushing for a department-wide review of traffic stop procedures, mandatory bias training, community oversight committees." He paused. "He's playing the long game, man." Chen felt something shift inside him. Not relief, exactly, but something more complicated. The judge wasn't just after a quick headline or revenge. He was after real change, and somehow that felt more terrifying than any punishment. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the department parking lot, where news vans still waited for any hint of a story. But the real story was happening in quiet conversations throughout the city, in courtrooms and break rooms, in homes and offices, where people were finally talking about things they'd been afraid to discuss for years. The truth has a way of snowballing, especially when someone starts digging. A week after the traffic stop incident, veteran reporter Lisa Wu sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of paper and empty coffee cups. She'd been going through Officer Chen's traffic stop records for the past 5 days, and what she found made her stomach turn. "Look at these numbers," she said, pointing to her computer screen as her editor leaned over her shoulder. "Over the past 3 years, 85% of his random traffic stops involved minority drivers. That's way above the department average." But that wasn't all. As she dug deeper, she uncovered a pattern that went beyond just one officer. The whole precinct had troubling statistics, but they'd managed to keep them quiet. Until now. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, the judge was reviewing a major police reform lawsuit that had been working its way through the system. The case had been filed months before his own incident, but now it carried extra weight. He knew every decision he made would be scrutinized, every word analyzed. "Your Honor," his clerk said, poking his head into the chambers, "Officer Chen's uncle is here to see you." The judge looked up, surprised. Everyone knew that Chen's uncle was a retired police captain with deep connections in the department. The judge adjusted his tie and nodded. "Send him in." The uncle walked in, his former authority still evident in his bearing despite being retired. "Judge," he said, "I'm here to talk about my nephew. I'm afraid I can't discuss any potential case." "I'm not here about that," the uncle interrupted, then caught himself. "I'm here because, well, our family has been in law enforcement for 3 generations. Robert, Officer Chen, he grew up hearing certain things, believing certain things. I'm not making excuses, but—" The judge leaned back in his chair, studying the older man's face. "You're saying these beliefs run deep." "I'm saying maybe we all have some learning to do," the uncle replied, his voice heavy with realization. "And maybe this incident is forcing some of us to finally face that." Across town, Chen sat in his first mandatory sensitivity training session. He'd walked in expecting the usual boring presentations and useless role-play exercises. Instead, he found himself listening to community members sharing their experiences with law enforcement. A successful business owner described being pulled over 3 times in 1 month. A college professor talked about teaching his teenage son how to act during traffic stops. A grandmother shared her fear every time her grandchildren drove at night. Chen felt something crack inside him as he listened. These weren't statistics or training videos. These were real people from his own community. People he was supposed to protect and serve. Back at the newspaper office, Lisa Wu's investigation was growing bigger by the hour. She discovered that several officers who'd tried to report discriminatory practices had been passed over for promotion. Others had been transferred to less desirable beats. The system didn't just allow bias, it protected it. "We need to run this story," she told her editor. "All of it." Her editor frowned at the draft on his screen. "The department's lawyers will come after us hard." "Let them," Lisa replied. "We have the numbers. We have the testimonies. And now, thanks to that traffic stop, we have everyone's attention." That evening, as the sun set over the city, Officer Walker found Chen sitting alone in the patrol car parking lot. He tapped on the window, then slid into the passenger seat when Chen unlocked the door. "Rough day?" Walker asked, though he already knew the answer. Chen stared through the windshield at nothing in particular. "You know what's weird? All these years, I thought I was just being a good cop, doing my job, following my instincts." He shook his head. "Now I'm wondering if what I called instincts were really just prejudices I never questioned." Walker nodded slowly. "The hardest part of change is admitting we need to change in the first place." As they sat there, Lisa Wu's first article was being finalized for the morning edition. The judge was reviewing the police reform case files. Community leaders were planning meetings. The wheels of change were turning, slow but steady, all because of one rainy night and one traffic stop that went wrong in all the right ways. The investigation was revealing more than just statistics and paperwork. It was exposing the human cost of unchecked bias and the silent courage of those who tried to fight it from within. The courtroom fell silent as the police reform case began. Every seat was filled, with people lining the walls at the back. The judge sat behind his bench, his face a mask of professional calm. Though this case hit closer to home than anyone could imagine. Today's hearing focused on department-wide training practices. The city's lawyers shuffled their papers nervously as community activists presented evidence of failed reforms and ignored complaints. In the third row, Officer Chen sat in civilian clothes, watching everything with new eyes. "Your Honor," the lead attorney for the reform advocates began, "we have documentation of over 200 incidents in the past year alone where officers failed to follow basic protocol during traffic stops." Chen felt eyes turn toward him. He was now the unwitting poster child for everything this case represented. His hands clasped tightly in his lap, he forced himself to stay seated, to face what he'd been part of. Outside the courthouse, Lisa Wu stood with her camera crew, delivering her latest update. Her investigation had expanded beyond Chen, beyond even the local department. "Sources tell us similar patterns exist in departments across the state," she reported. "This case could set a precedent for reform nationwide." During the lunch break, Chen found himself in the courthouse cafeteria, staring at a coffee he couldn't bring himself to drink. A shadow fell across his table, and he looked up to see the judge standing there. "Mind if I join you?" the judge asked. Chen nearly knocked over his coffee standing up. "Your Honor, I don't think I should." "Sit down, Officer Chen," the judge said quietly. "This isn't about that night anymore. This is about something bigger." They sat in awkward silence for a moment. Around them, other diners pretended not to stare while stealing glances at this unlikely pair. "Why did you recuse yourself from my case?" Chen finally asked. The judge stirred his own coffee thoughtfully. "Because this isn't about personal revenge. It's about fixing a broken system. And that takes clear heads and unbiased judgment." Back in the courtroom, the afternoon session brought surprising testimony. Officer Walker took the stand, describing years of witnessing problematic practices. His voice shook slightly. Testifying against fellow officers went against everything he'd been taught about police brotherhood. "The problem isn't just a few bad officers," Walker explained. "It's about a culture that makes good officers afraid to speak up." In the gallery, Chen's uncle sat with his hands gripped together. Each word of testimony seemed to age him, forcing him to confront his own role in perpetuating the problems during his years as captain. Later that day, protesters gathered outside the courthouse, but not with angry signs or shouted slogans. Instead, they held a peaceful vigil. Community leaders shared stories, former officers spoke about the need for change, and family members of those affected by biased policing talked about their hopes for the future. Chen watched from his car across the street, remembering how differently he used to see such gatherings. He'd viewed them as threats to order, but now he saw them as people seeking something simple: fair treatment under the law. His phone buzzed. Another message from the department psychiatrist about his mandatory counseling sessions. He'd resisted at first, seeing them as punishment. Now, after 3 sessions, he was starting to understand their value. The sun was setting when Lisa Wu approached his car, notepad in hand. Chen rolled down his window, expecting more hard questions about his record. "Officer Chen," she said, "I'm working on a piece about officers who've changed their perspectives after similar incidents. Would you be willing to share your story?" He looked at her for a long moment. A month ago, he would have seen her as the enemy, just another reporter trying to make cops look bad. Now he saw someone trying to understand the whole story, not just the headlines. "Yeah," he said finally, "but not just my story. There's a bigger picture here that needs to be told." As darkness fell over the courthouse, the judge sat in his chambers, reviewing the day's testimony. On his desk lay 2 items: the police report from his traffic stop and a draft of new department-wide training procedures. One represented the problem, the other a step toward solution. The case was far from over, but something had shifted. In courtrooms and police stations, in community centers and living rooms, people weren't just talking about change anymore. They were making it happen, one honest conversation at a time. Officer Chen stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie before his first day back on active duty. His hands trembled slightly as he smoothed down his uniform. 3 months of desk duty, sensitivity training, and counseling had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. His phone lit up with a text from his teenage daughter. "Good luck today, Dad. Remember what we talked about." He smiled, remembering their conversations over the past months. She'd been the first one in his family to really challenge his views, showing him YouTube videos and social media posts that opened his eyes to perspectives he'd never considered. At the morning briefing, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Some officers still wouldn't meet his eyes, while others gave him supportive nods. Chief Richardson cleared his throat, addressing the room. "Today marks the start of our new community engagement protocols," the chief announced. "Every traffic stop will now require both dashboard and body camera footage. And yes, this means extra paperwork. But after recent events, we all know why this matters." Chen felt the weight of those words. He was no longer just Officer Chen. He was a symbol of why these changes were necessary. As he headed to his patrol car, Officer Walker fell into step beside him. "You ready for this?" Walker asked, genuine concern in his voice. "No," Chen replied honestly. "But that's probably a good thing." His first traffic stop of the day came just after noon. A silver minivan, burned out taillight. Chen's heart pounded as he approached the vehicle, consciously noting his own reactions, his assumptions, the way his hand automatically rested near his holster. The counseling sessions had taught him to recognize these ingrained habits. The driver was a young mother with 2 kids in car seats. In the past, Chen might have been aggressive, might have looked for an excuse to search the vehicle. Instead, he smiled, explained the taillight issue, and wrote a fix-it ticket. The woman's relief at his professional demeanor was obvious, and that realization stung. Back at the courthouse, the judge was meeting with community leaders about the ongoing police reform case. Lisa Wu sat in on the meeting, taking notes as they discussed new training programs and oversight committees. The real challenge, one community leader explained, isn't just changing policies. It's changing hearts and minds. The judge nodded, thinking of his recent conversation with Chen in the courthouse cafeteria. Sometimes, he said, change happens in unexpected ways. That evening, Chen attended a community meeting at the local library. Just walking into that room took more courage than any late-night patrol. He sat quietly in the back, listening as residents shared their experiences with law enforcement. Each story hit him like a physical blow, because now he could see himself in the officers they described. During the break, an elderly man approached him. Chen recognized him from the sensitivity training sessions. He'd been one of the speakers who'd shared his experiences. "Didn't expect to see you here," the man said, sitting down next to Chen. "Honestly, me neither," Chen replied. "But I'm trying to learn." The man studied him for a moment. "You know what's harder than admitting you were wrong? Doing something about it." As they talked, Chen's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his uncle, the retired captain. "Proud of you, kid. It takes guts to be part of the solution." Later that night, driving home after his shift, Chen passed the spot where he pulled over the judge all those months ago. The rain-slicked street looked different now, or maybe he was the one who'd changed. His daughter had asked him once if he regretted that night. The truth was complicated. He regretted his actions, but not where they'd led him. At home, he found his daughter waiting up, working on a school paper about social change. She looked up as he walked in, still in uniform. "How was it?" she asked. Chen sat down heavily on the couch. "Different," he said finally. "Everything looks different now." Good different. He thought about the day, the traffic stop, the community meeting, the looks from other officers, the weight of change on his shoulders. Harder, he admitted, but better. Through his living room window, he could see the city lights spreading out into the distance. Somewhere out there, the judge was probably reviewing cases. Lisa Wu was probably working on her next story. Officer Walker was probably on patrol. They were all part of this change now, whether they'd chosen it or not. The police reform case had grown bigger than anyone expected. On this particular morning, the courtroom wasn't just packed with local residents and reporters. State officials and civil rights leaders filled the gallery. The evidence being presented wasn't just about one department anymore. It was exposing problems across the entire state. Lisa Wu sat in her usual spot, her laptop open as she live-tweeted the proceedings. Her investigation had earned her a National Journalism Award, but more importantly, it had sparked similar investigations in other cities. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from reporters across the country, all asking the same question: could this happen in our city too? The judge listened intently as experts presented data showing how biased policing affected everything from employment to housing to education. But what caught everyone's attention was the next witness, Officer Chen himself. Chen walked to the witness stand, his uniform pressed perfectly, his face showing the weight of what he was about to do. No one had expected him to testify. The police union had even advised against it. But here he was, Please state your name and occupation, the court clerk said. Officer Robert Chen. I've been with the department for 12 years. His voice was steady, though his hands were clasped tightly together. Officer Chen, the attorney began. Can you tell us about how your perspective on policing has changed in recent months? Chen took a deep breath. In the gallery, his daughter sat between his uncle and Officer Walker, all three watching intently. I used to think I was just doing my job, Chen began. I had what I called instincts about suspicious behavior. But those instincts, he paused, looking directly at the judge, they were really just prejudices I'd never questioned. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the ceiling fans spinning. Chen continued, describing how the training sessions and community meetings had opened his eyes. He talked about reviewing his own body camera footage from past stops, seeing his behavior from a new perspective. The hardest part wasn't admitting I was wrong, he said. It was realizing how many people I'd hurt while thinking I was right. During the lunch break, Lisa Wu found Chen's daughter in the courthouse cafeteria. The teenager was picking at a sandwich, clearly processing everything she'd heard. Your dad's very brave, Lisa said, sitting down. The girl nodded. He's different now. Sometimes I catch him watching the news about police incidents in other cities, and he gets this look, like he's seeing things he never saw before. Back in the courtroom, the afternoon session brought surprising support for the reforms. Several veteran officers, inspired by Chen's testimony, came forward with their own stories of wanting change, but feeling powerless to make it happen. Officer Walker testified about the unofficial codes that kept problems hidden. We had these unwritten rules, he explained. Don't question another officer's decisions. Don't report minor incidents. Don't rock the boat. The judge watched it all, maintaining his professional demeanor even as the testimony confirmed everything he'd experienced that rainy night. During a brief recess, he found himself standing next to Chen near the water fountain. Officer, he said quietly, your testimony today. It wasn't easy, was it? Chen shook his head. No, sir. But neither was standing up to that traffic stop that night. You could have just shown your badge right away, made things easier for yourself. Sometimes the harder path is the right one, the judge replied. As the day's session ended, reporters crowded around Chen, but he politely declined interviews. Instead, he walked out with his daughter and uncle, heading to the small diner where they'd been having weekly family dinners to talk through everything that was happening. At their usual booth, his uncle spoke up. When I was captain, I could have done more. Should have done more. But watching you today, maybe it's never too late to stand up for what's right. Through the diner window, they could see protesters gathering for their daily vigil. But something was different today. Mixed in with the usual crowd were police officers, some in uniform, some not, standing shoulder to shoulder with community members. Chen's daughter took a photo of the scene. Mind if I post this? She asked. People need to see that change is possible. Her father nodded, watching as more officers joined the gathering outside. The system wasn't fixed. Not yet. But for the first time, it felt like real change wasn't just possible. It was inevitable. The call that changed everything came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Officer Chen was reviewing traffic stop reports when Chief Richardson appeared at his desk, looking more serious than usual. The state legislature wants you to testify, the chief said, dropping a formal letter on Chen's desk. They're drafting new police reform laws. Your story, well, it's gotten their attention. Chen picked up the letter with trembling hands. 6 months ago, he'd been just another officer with a problematic record. Now he was being asked to help shape state law. The weight of it felt almost too heavy to bear. At home that evening, he spread the letter out on the kitchen table. His daughter sat across from him, doing homework while sneaking glances at her father's worried face. You don't look happy about this, she said, closing her textbook. I'm not sure I'm the right person, he replied honestly, after everything I did wrong. Maybe that's exactly why you're the right person, she countered. You can't change the past, Dad, but you're trying to fix the future. The next morning, Chen found himself in Officer Walker's car, heading to the state capitol. The 3-hour drive gave them time to talk about how far things had come. Police training had already changed dramatically in their department. Every officer now wore body cameras that couldn't be turned off during stops. Community oversight meetings happened weekly instead of yearly. "Remember how angry everyone was at first?" Walker asked, keeping his eyes on the road. "Now half the department shows up voluntarily for the community meetings." Chen nodded, thinking about the previous week's meeting. Officers and residents had sat together, sharing coffee and actually listening to each other. Real conversations were happening, hard but necessary ones. At the Capitol building, Lisa Wu was already setting up her camera equipment when they arrived. She'd been following this story from the beginning, and her reports had helped spread the message nationwide. She gave Chen an encouraging nod as he walked past. The hearing room was packed. Police chiefs from across the state sat alongside community leaders, civil rights attorneys, and reform advocates. The judge was there too, sitting quietly in the back row. He'd become an unexpected ally in the push for change, using his position to support reforms while remaining impartial in specific cases. When Chen's turn came to speak, he stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. His prepared speech felt suddenly inadequate. Instead, he spoke from the heart. "I'm not here as a model officer," he began. "I'm here as someone who got it wrong for years, who finally had to face that truth. The hardest part wasn't admitting my mistakes. It was realizing that every biased traffic stop, every unfair search, every time I let prejudice guide my actions, I wasn't just breaking trust with the community. I was betraying my own oath to protect and serve." The room fell silent. Even the legislators stopped their usual shuffling of papers and checking of phones. "We need more than just new rules," Chen continued. "We need a complete change in how we think about policing. It's not us versus them. It's just us, all of us, trying to build safer communities together." As he spoke, his phone buzzed silently in his pocket. Later, he'd find messages from his daughter, his uncle, and dozens of fellow officers, all watching the live stream of his testimony. In the back of the room, the judge watched with quiet satisfaction. This wasn't the ending he'd expected when he was pulled over that rainy night, but sometimes the best changes come from unexpected places. After the hearing, Chen found himself surrounded by officers from other departments, all wanting to share their own stories of struggling with change. One veteran cop pulled him aside. "I've been on the force 30 years, the older officer said, his voice rough with emotion. "Kept telling myself I was one of the good ones. But hearing you today made me realize being good isn't enough if we stay silent about what's wrong." Outside the Capitol building, the evening news crews were setting up their cameras. Another protest was forming, but this one was different. Officers in uniform stood together with community members, holding signs that read "Change starts with us," and "Reform is everyone's responsibility." Chen's daughter had shared the live coverage on her social media, adding her own comment, "Proud of you, Dad. This is what real change looks like." As the sun set behind the Capitol dome, Chen stood with Walker, watching the peaceful gathering. "Think it'll last?" Walker asked. Chen thought about everything that had happened since that traffic stop. "It has too," he replied. "We've come too far to go back now." 1 year later, the city looked different, not in its buildings or streets, but in the way people moved through it. Outside the police department, a new sign read "Community First, Service Always," installed the day the state's reform bill passed. Officer Chen sat in his patrol car, watching the morning traffic flow past. His laptop showed the department's new dashboard. Every traffic stop now tracked and analyzed in real time for patterns of bias. The system he'd once resisted had become a tool he relied on to check his own decisions. His radio crackled. "All units, remember today's community forum at 3 p.m. Attendance is voluntary, but encouraged." Chen smiled, remembering how these forums used to be empty except for angry voices on both sides. Now they were places of real dialogue. sometimes difficult but always necessary. His phone lit up with a text from his daughter. "Dad, turn on the news." He flipped on the car's screen to see Lisa Wu reporting live from Washington, D.C. "The police reform bill that started in one small city has now passed the Senate," she announced. "What began with a single traffic stop has evolved into national legislation that will change how departments across the country operate." The camera panned to show the judge standing among the lawmakers and advocates. He'd been invited to speak about how local changes could spark national reform. Chen felt a mix of pride and humility. That rainy night felt both like yesterday and a lifetime ago. At the courthouse, the judge was packing his briefcase for his flight back home when his clerk rushed in. "Sir, you need to see this." Outside, police officers and community members were gathering, not for a protest this time, but for a celebration. The reform bill's passage meant real, lasting change was coming. Chen drove to the courthouse, parking his patrol car among the growing crowd. He spotted Officer Walker talking with some rookie officers, part of the first class trained under the new system. "Look who made it," Walker called out. "The man who started it all." Chen shook his head. "We all started it. Some of us just took longer to join in." The crowd parted as the judge emerged from the courthouse. For a moment, he and Chen looked at each other across the plaza. Then the judge walked over, extending his hand. "Officer Chen," he said warmly. "Still doing traffic stops?" "Yes, sir," Chen replied. "But doing them right now." His daughter appeared, cell phone in hand as always. "The video of that night just hit 10 million views again," she said. "People are sharing it with a new hashtag, #HowChange The celebration turned into an impromptu community gathering. Food trucks appeared. Someone set up speakers playing music, and people who might never have spoken to each other a year ago were sharing stories and hopes for the future. Lisa Wu moved through the crowd, collecting interviews for her final piece on the story. She found Chen's uncle, the retired captain, talking with young officers about the old days versus the new. "The hardest thing for old-timers like me," he was saying, "was admitting we needed to change. But watching my nephew stand up and speak truth, that showed me change is always possible." As evening approached, Chen's daughter grabbed his arm. "Dad, look." She pointed to where several patrol cars were parked. Their lights were flashing, but not in the usual red and blue. Someone had programmed them to create a rainbow effect, a symbol of unity that lit up the gathering dusk. The judge stood on the courthouse steps, watching it all. His clerk handed him the latest statistics. Complaints down 60%, community trust up 75%, and most importantly, a new generation of officers being trained to see their role differently. Chen joined him on the steps. "I never properly thanked you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For not just showing your badge that night. For letting it play out. For seeing that something bigger could come from it." The judge smiled. Sometimes justice works in unexpected ways. As night fell, the crowd began to thin, but something remained in the air. A sense that this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The real work of maintaining change would continue tomorrow and every day after. Chen's daughter took one final photo of the scene. Officers and citizens talking freely, the rainbow lights reflecting off the courthouse columns, her father and the judge standing together on the steps. She posted it with a simple caption. "This is what change looks like. This is what hope feels like." Under the stars, in a city that had learned to look at itself honestly and choose to be better, the story had come full circle, not to an ending, but to a new chapter, one that would be written by all of them, together.